All right, so everyone, welcome to this webinar. I'm Dustin Briles and I take care of technology stuff at SEM. Thank you for all taking the time to come out, or I guess get on your computers and come watch this in the middle of your day to be here with us, and special thanks if you do business with us. When it comes to security, I always say your success is our success and vice versa. We understand that it can be hard to stay on top of security threats and best practices, so our goal here is just to make sure everyone receives some education on how to protect themselves. This is also why we conduct periodic phishing simulations on our advisors. Our goal isn't to shame anybody, but the best way to get better at not falling for real phishing attacks is 1, to get training, and 2, to practice with simulated phishing attacks. This webinar will be divided into 2 sections. The first section, which will be the bulk of this webinar, deals with phishing attacks. It's not always obvious when an email is malicious, especially if you're flipping through a ton of emails every day, which I know is definitely some of you. So we'll spend some time talking about what to look for. Phishing attacks, which are a significant threat not only in the finance industry, but also to any industry that uses the internet or sends and receives email, which I think is all the industries. For better or worse, I'm not sure you can exist as a business or even as a member of American society without using the internet these days. Phishing attacks are not the only thing you should be concerned about in the realm of cybersecurity, though. So in the second section, we'll go over other best practices that I think go a long way towards improving your online security posture. And also, before we begin, if you have questions during the webinar, you can just type them in the chat and I'll try to address them as we go or at the end if there's time. And the chat should be along the top bar. You should see a little, it kind of looks like a message bubble, something like you might see on your phone for the messages icon. You just click on that and you'll see the chat. You just type in your question there. So let's begin. It might be helpful if we begin by defining social engineering, which phishing is a subset of. Social engineering refers to the exploitation of human beings by using deception. This usually involves things like false trust, misinformation, a sense of urgency, and threats, things like this. Some specific examples of this might be if you were to convince someone to hold open a door to an employees only area, even though you're not an employee, just because you're holding a bunch of boxes and can't get the door yourself. And naturally, the other person wants to be nice and it looks like you're struggling and you ask them to open the door. And so, of course, they're going to open it for you. That would be social engineering. You could also send a realistic looking but fake share file email to a bunch of people and hope that they click on the malicious link and enter their username and password, which a lot of you are familiar with recently. You could also post authentic sounding but fake news stories on social media to try and influence public opinion. And there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down there, not even just in terms of technology, but in the social political aspect. But we definitely do not have time for that today. I'm going to try to keep this webinar to 30 minutes or less. But honestly, I think the most classic example of social engineering is the story of the Trojan horse. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, it's there was this thing during the mythological Trojan War where the Greek army gave the city of Troy a large wooden horse as a peace offering. So the Trojans opened their gates, very excited, I'm sure, to have this war be over, and brought in the horse. But what they didn't know was that inside of the horse, hollowed out, actually, the horse was, inside of the horse was a bunch of Greek soldiers, and they would soon jump out of the horse and capture the city. Classic story of deception there. So on to phishing specifically. As you might have guessed, phishing with a PH is a play on the word fishing with an F. It's a type of social engineering that is designed to lure someone in and quote unquote catch information or access that you wouldn't normally be able to or allowed to get. A successful phishing attack is usually the start of a larger attack, not the end goal itself. So after a successful phishing attack, an attacker could go on to do things like steal customer records, drop ransomware on your network. They could extort employees to get more access. They could deface your website. They could use your email to send another phishing campaign to your contacts list using your reputation as the lure. And the list goes on. Though email is the most common attack vector today, phishing attacks can be conducted using other mediums too. You can do this over the phone. You can do this over the postal system. You can do this in person. In fact, we even have different categories for different types of phishing. So first, there's regular old phishing, which is where you send out a bunch of emails, like high volume of emails with the same template, which in my experience, the template probably does not look very good. There was not a lot of time put into this template. And that's okay because the attackers are really playing a numbers game here. They can send their terrible looking email template to a giant pool of email addresses, and chances are that they'll catch at least a few people who just aren't paying attention that day. There's also spear phishing, which is a targeted attack sent to a relatively small number of people. When an attacker runs a spear phishing campaign, they've usually done a little more homework and they conduct the phishing campaign with a higher degree of precision. Consequently, the emails and the website probably look quite a bit more convincing than the regular phishing campaign that's sent out to a lot of people. Also, whaling, which could be considered a type of spear phishing attack, but specifically this is aimed at high value targets. And high value could mean people who are personally very wealthy and have a lot of money that you could steal from them. But it could also mean an employee with access to the company's bank accounts, or an employee with access to the database of customer records. There's also vishing, which is any type of phishing attack that is conducted using a phone call. And you get this word by combining the words voice and phishing, so you get vishing. There's also smishing, and that's similar to vishing, but the attacks are carried out over text message, which are text messages are also known as SMS messages. So if you combine SMS and phishing, you get smishing. And so naturally, the question is, how much should we care or why should we care about phishing? And if you used the internet 15, 20 years ago, you probably remember some of those early phishing emails we had back then, such as this one, which is classic, the Crown Prince of Nigeria who wants to send you money because it turns out somehow you're part of his bloodline. All you got to do is reply to the email with some of your banking information and he'll send that money right over. Or you have a long lost cousin who somehow you've never met and he needs money and he needs you to go rush down to your Western Union and send him a money order right now or he's going to die. So these seem pretty silly now, but as we have gotten better at recognizing these early forms of phishing attacks, the attackers have also upped their game. It's basically an arms race. One thing that has not changed is human beings are still vulnerable to social engineering attacks. Humans are still vulnerable to manipulation. So every year, Verizon generates an annual report about security incidents, and breaches. This report uses data that comes both from incidents that Verizon has investigated itself and also data that's provided from external contributors. Here are some stats pulled from this 2021 report that they just released. And most of you watching this webinar probably work for a small business in the finance sector. If so, this should put some things into perspective. I sometimes hear people say that small businesses aren't as big a target for cyber attacks as maybe larger businesses. And people cite various reasons for this opinion, but let's see if it lines up with reality. So the first thing from this report that stood out to me was that small businesses actually had more incidents in the last year than large businesses. So you are not insulated from cyber attacks if you work for a small business. Also, 85% of breaches involved some sort of human element, so like social engineering. Remember that human beings tend to be the weakest link in any security program because you can convince a human to do something that it was not programmed to do. Computers tend to do what they're programmed to do unless there's a vulnerability, of course, that's a separate discussion. But human beings are very prone to manipulation. Also, 36% of all breaches involved phishing attacks, which is an increase from the last time this report came out. So basically, there are more phishing attacks happening. And business email compromise, or BEC, was the second most common form of social engineering. Business email compromise is a fancy way of saying that an employee's email account was hacked. BEC is a big deal because, as you can imagine, there is a lot that an attacker can do from there. I mean, it's not hard to imagine all the things you could do with access to somebody's email account. You could start resetting passwords, gain access to accounts, break into their Facebook, Instagram, and that's just on a personal level. It's not hard to imagine what could happen at a business level either. Also, ransomware is more frequent in the last year than compared to the previous report. And as far as ransomware goes, one of the most common initial vectors for ransomware to get into your network is by phishing. You give away access or username and password to some critical system, and the attacker drops ransomware, and then you and your company are having a very bad day. So if your company is breached, there are some obvious implications, I think. There's the loss of revenue, there's the loss of trust from your clients, there's paying someone to clean up the mess, etc. But perhaps not so obvious is what the SEC or FINRA might do in addition to all of that. The SEC recently put out a press release detailing charges against 8 financial firms for failures in their cybersecurity policies and procedures. So the failures of these firms resulted in email account takeovers, which is basically business email compromise. And this exposed the personal information of many, many clients at each firm. In total, it was thousands of people who had their personal information exposed. These firms were grouped together into 3 groups of entities, and they all got fines, in addition to some censures and other discipline from the SEC. The Cetera entities were fined $300,000, the Cambridge entities were fined $250,000, and the KMS entities were fined $200,000. There's more here to discuss than just phishing, but we'll move on in the interest of time. Let's talk about how to identify phishing emails. Here is the exact phishing email that SEM sent out to our advisors recently as part of our most recent phishing simulation. This would be an example of a spear phishing attack. You can see that it looks pretty similar to a real ShareFile notification email. There are references to SEM Wealth Management in the body, and even the subject line is the same as a real ShareFile notification email. There are some serious red flags here, though. We'll use them as opportunities to talk about how to look for red flags in general. Most of the screenshots that I'll show are from the desktop version of Outlook, but the concepts are applicable to the web and mobile versions of Outlook and other email clients too. The first thing we'll look at is the email address and display name in the email. When you send an email, it will often contain a display name. Most of the time, your email client will set your display name for you. Often, it'll be your name. However, with a little technical knowledge, you can set the display name to whatever you want. This is by design because the display name is not meant to be an authoritative source of information. It's meant to be more of a helpful hint to identify who is sending you an email. So naturally, this is ripe for some exploitation. The first image you see here is the header of an email that comes legitimately from technology@semwealth.com. You'll see that a display name is set to SEM Technology. The second image shows the header of an email where I manually set the display name to Shaggy Rogers in an attempt to make it look like it came from Scooby-Doo's best friend. Something notable about this is that the display name is shown in front of the actual email address, which makes it a little easier to hide a malicious email address with a crafty display name. On top of that, in certain views on certain email clients, you might only see the display name at first. So here's some examples of that. The left is Outlook for iOS and the right is just your regular inbox in Outlook before you've clicked on the email. You can see the display name can be used to divert attention away from the email address pretty effectively. The good news, though, is that you can always reveal the actual email address. If you've opened the email and still can't see the from address, usually you just have to click or tap on the display name or somewhere around there and it will appear. The pictures here show how that works in Outlook for iOS, but you can do this in the desktop Outlook client too and Outlook for Android, and it's similar in Gmail as well. Notice that in this case, the actual email address is semphishingtest@gmail.com. And we meant for this to be a dead giveaway. So if you checked the email address, you should have known right off the bat that despite the display name, this email was part of a phishing test. It's not always this way though. Sometimes the email address obviously does not agree with the display name or the content of the email, like in our phishing test here, but other times both the display name and email address are totally legitimate. This is one of the reasons that business email compromise is a big deal. If you get hacked, the hacker can then turn around and use your legitimate email address to send phishing emails. Now, it would be pretty obvious if, let's say, Janet from HR sent you an email asking you to reset your Office 365 password. Like, obviously, that's not something that Janet from HR is going to send to you in any legitimate scenario. But what if Janet from HR sent you a booby-trapped PDF? Let's say it was a PDF that said, hey, here's new member benefits for healthcare, and it was a booby-trapped PDF. That could reasonably happen in real life. Or what if she said that there was a problem with your payroll information and included a link to a fake login page to your HR system? That would be a bigger deal. Now, this is why the context of the email also matters. You can ask yourself a few questions about the context of an email to try and establish how suspicious the email is. The first question you can ask is, were you expecting to get this email? How unsolicited was this email? If you ask yourself this question and the answer is no, I was not expecting to get this email, that doesn't guarantee that it's a phishing attack, but it should cause you to pay closer attention before taking any action. For example, in this share file notification email, you'll notice that the name of the uploaded file is account closing updated.pdf. Now, you should probably already know if one of your clients is working on closing an account, especially if this is an updated version of a document. So the fact that you got this email should be very unexpected. You shouldn't be finding out about this for the first time via a share file notification email from SEM. But other examples of unexpected emails might include, you've probably gotten some of these. One says, there's a problem with your account. Maybe this is like PayPal or Amazon or whatever. You get that unexpectedly, even though you've logged in successfully, there's been no problems with your account in the last little while. That would be unexpected. You could also get you've received a voicemail email, even though your phone never rang, your phone works, you are getting voicemails just fine, and they don't look like this. That would be unexpected. You could receive an email that says payment received or invoice paid, something like that, even though you haven't paid anybody anything recently. That would be unexpected as well. You could also ask yourself if the email contains something unusual. Are there spelling or grammar mistakes? Is there unnecessarily vague information? Is it asking you to act fast or instill a sense of urgency or fear? These are not silver bullet questions either, but they can help solidify your confidence, or lack thereof, in the legitimacy of an email. In our fake share file email, you'll notice that there is nothing in the name of the file to help identify the client or the account number in question, which is unusually vague. Usually we would include that information so that you kind of have an idea of what the file is about before you open it. You can also ask yourself if you can verify the legitimacy of this email or the content or the action that it's asking you to take outside of the email. And that brings us to our next point. And that is, if there is one single piece of advice that I could give about phishing emails, it would be this. Do not click on any links in any emails unless you absolutely have to. You should go directly to the website yourself and look for the information in question. In the case of ShareFile, you can go straight to the website, log in, and view new or updated files without clicking any links in any emails. If you bookmark it, or even better, have a password manager, which you should be using anyway, this should expedite the whole process so much that it's not really much slower, if at all, than clicking the link in the email anyway. And if you're using a password manager, the whole process might even be faster sometimes, because you go to your password manager and go to the website and it autofills and logs in for you, so you don't spend any time typing anything. However, there are circumstances where you do need to click the link. For example, if you request a password reset, what's probably going to happen is you're going to get an email with a link that you have to click in order to reset your password. In that scenario, though, you could go back to the first and second question and you could answer them and say, yes, I absolutely did expect to receive this email because I requested a password reset. This is totally expected. And is it unusual that it's asking you to click a link? Well, no, because that's exactly how password resets work. So the first two questions would give you a lot of confidence that it is legitimate. It's kind of expected if you click reset my password and you immediately get an email with a link to reset your password. there's not really anything to be concerned about there. Another thing you can do if you're unsure is inspect the URL of the link you're about to click on. In Outlook and other popular email clients, if you hover your mouse over a link, a pop-up will appear with the link's address. As you can see here, the link in the email would take you to what looks like the SEM Wealth ShareFile domain, but it's not quite. You'll notice there's a dash between SEM Wealth and ShareFile when there should be a period. Sometimes the link is really long, hard to read, or maybe you just want to take a closer look at it for other reasons. And so you can actually right click and hit copy hyperlink and then paste it in a notepad file or somewhere else. And that will allow you to take a closer look. And honestly, I used to put a bigger emphasis on inspecting the link in an email before clicking it, but I don't put so much of an emphasis on it anymore. I do think it's something that you should do if you're having trouble making a decision based on other factors, the ones we've already talked about. But link URLs can be confusing, and they might not be helpful at all in either direction anyway. And kind of here's what I mean by that. So for example, on mobile devices, the way that you would inspect a link URL is by long pressing on the link. But in some email clients, like Outlook for iOS, this will load a preview of the resulting website. Essentially, it clicks the link and shows you a preview of the website it leads to. You can see this in the second screenshot on the right here. Clicking a link is sometimes all it takes to get yourself in trouble, so this is not at all ideal if you're unsure about the email in the first place. Occasionally, you may see emails where the link URL isn't helpful one way or the other at all. So the links that you'll see from mass emailers are a good example of this, such as MailChimp or Substack. So are links made with a URL shortener like bit.ly or tinyURL. You can inspect these, but you simply cannot really get any good information in either direction by looking at these links. It could be good, it could be bad. You can't tell just by the URL. So summing all these things up, let's review. There are some good points here. The first is that you should consider the context. I would say that this is probably the most important. Ask yourself those 3 questions and analyze your answers, and that should give you a pretty good feel with where you sit about the legitimacy of the email before moving on. Remember that these questions don't guarantee that an email is or is not malicious, but they can give you pretty good confidence one way or the other. The other way, or the other thing that you should consider is, can you go to the website directly and log in with a known good URL like a bookmark or a password manager? This is always the preferred option, but sometimes it's not possible. Keep that in mind, like with password reset emails. Also look at the display name and the email address and try to see if they're pulling any shenanigans there. If the display name, email address, and context are not enough to give you confidence one way or the other, and you can't go to the website directly, you can always try to inspect the URL. Just keep in mind that in some cases that might not give you enough information to make a decision. You can also always ask a coworker what their opinion is, or contact the source company or person who sent you the email, or supposedly who sent you the email, and ask them if it's legitimate. There's nothing wrong with this, and some of our business partners have reached out directly to SEM in the past to verify the legitimacy of various emails, some from ShareFile. However, the one thing that I will caution you on is don't reply directly to the suspicious email itself, because if that mailbox is compromised, there's nothing stopping the attacker on the other end from replying back to you and saying, yes, of course, this is legitimate. And I've personally seen this happen, like in real time. Verifying the legitimacy of an email is important because clicking on the link in a malicious email is not great. It can get you in trouble just by itself. But as we've seen, most phishing attacks are after your username and password. They're trying to do business email compromise. And so it's also a good idea to be able to recognize fishy web pages. Fortunately, most of the techniques we've learned about inspecting an email also work when inspecting a web page. Normally, one of the first red flags that you should look for on a phishing site is how it looks. For example, here, if you use our ShareFile site with any degree of regularity, you will notice that this does not look the same as the login page at all. You could also open a new tab, go to the known good page, and compare the two. You may have also noticed that the URL is slightly different. It's got that same semwealth-sharefile.com in there. But as we learned, URLs can be confusing, hard to decipher, and they might not give you good information either way, which brings us to our next point and the first point in our general security advice, which is use a password manager. Humans might struggle to figure out if a URL is legitimate, but a password manager will do a much better job than you will. As you can see here in the picture on the right, if you've saved your credentials for ShareFile in a password manager, it's going to give you suggestions for autofilling your username and password when you're on the legitimate website. But if you're on a phishing page hosted on a different domain, your password manager shouldn't give you any suggestions at all. You can see this in the left picture. Even if the URL looks similar to a human being, a password manager will know if the URL is different from the one that you have saved. So if you go to a website where normally your password manager autofills or gives you suggestions, but on this particular occasion, it does not give you those things, this should immediately raise your suspicions. Sometimes a web app's URL does change legitimately, but this happens very often, and in any case, you should default to immediately suspicious. I would say like probably 99% of the time, if it doesn't autofill, something wrong is happening. I would say that this is probably the single best method for identifying a phishing page, at least for a page that you have a saved credential for. And password managers have other benefits as well, so let's talk about those. Many people have tens or hundreds of online accounts these days. Best practice is to have a totally unique password for each of those accounts. And the reason for this is that attackers know that humans tend to reuse passwords all over the place, and will use that fact to conduct a type of attack known as credential stuffing. So imagine this scenario. You have reused the same password for your Facebook account, your online banking account, and also for a random online store where you bought flowers for a loved one a few years ago. As it turns out, totally unbeknownst to you, that online flower shop got hacked, and everybody's username and password got dumped out into the back alleys of the internet. Hackers can now take this list or this database of compromised passwords and try it with other websites, like Facebook and your online bank. In essence, you trusted the security of your online banking account and Facebook to the security practices of a random online flower shop. And now you're about to experience the consequences of that, because they're going to break into your account with your totally legitimate username and password. Hackers have gotten pretty good at automating this, and they can try compromised passwords on thousands of popular websites very quickly. Some people have resorted to keeping their passwords in a basic Excel file, Word file, a plain text file, or writing them down, keeping them on a sticky note, or some other insecure thing, especially in the office. And honestly, just passwords managers are a fantastic alternative, and that's where everybody should be going right now. So a password manager is basically a vault, which contains your username, passwords, and what website or service that they're used for. This vault is heavily encrypted and can only be accessed by using a single master password. This allows you to generate and store incredibly secure passwords for all of your websites, and you never have to remember any of them. You only need to remember the one single master password to get into your password manager. Many password managers also allow you to share passwords with other people. So if your company has an Amazon Prime account, for example, you can share this password with everyone who needs it without having to write it down or jump through a bunch of hoops if that password gets changed. You just change it in the password manager and everyone has access to the updated password. Consequently, though, this does mean that you need to make a very good master password, and that you don't give out that master password to anybody, because if somebody has it, they can log into your password manager and gain access to all of your usernames and passwords all in one place, which is obviously very bad. Some common password managers are LastPass, 1Password, and Bitwarden. We use LastPass at SEM, but I know plenty of people have had a great experience with 1Password and Bitwarden as well, and actually all three are pretty cost friendly. All of them are cloud solutions, which means that you can access them from anywhere and on mobile devices too. And if you don't like your passwords being stored in a cloud service, you can also use a local password manager like KeePass. I personally used KeePass at a previous job until we started using LastPass, and it worked fine. You just couldn't share passwords with anybody. Also, you need to be using two-factor authentication or 2FA wherever you can. The basic value proposition here is that even if someone were to get a hold of your username and password, they would not be able to log into your account without the 2FA code. So it's basically a second layer of security. And 2FA, or you might have heard this multi-factor authentication as well, MFA, it's already a best practice and it is quickly becoming standard practice. So a brief explanation of two-factor authentication is this. When we say a factor of authentication, we mean one of these three things. There's one, something you know, and an example of this would be a password because you know a password, you store it in your brain. There's also something you have. An example of this would be a little hardware token or an authenticator app on your physical phone. And then the third category is something you are, and this almost always refers to biometrics, so like your fingerprint. Two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication refers to the use of two or more of these factors to log into something. And you may have dealt with a version of this when logging into Instagram, Twitter, Amazon, PayPal, or whatever. When you enter your username and password, but before you're allowed in, a text message is sent to your cell phone with a short code that you also have to submit. And technically that's not true two-factor authentication, but it's better than just a password if we're being honest. A good usable choice these days is authenticator apps, which have a nice balance between security and usability. And an authenticator app is just an app that you put on your phone, and then you add one of your online accounts to this app, usually by scanning a QR code. And then when you go to log into one of those accounts, you pull up the authenticator app and get a 6-digit code, and you enter that. So it's very similar to like the text message code, except you get it from the authenticator app. And also that code will usually recycle itself every 30 seconds. Yeah, so in that way, it's pretty similar to a text message code, but under the hood, it's a lot more secure than text message. And the reason for that is beyond the scope of this, but there's good reason for it. As for authenticator apps themselves, there are a bunch to choose from. I personally like Authy, but there are plenty of others like Duo, Google Authenticator. And the topic of two-factor authentication is also something that I've talked about in the SEM technology blog, so feel free to go there and check it out. It's also very likely that you've had at least one online account that has been part of a breach in the last 10 or so years. And I mentioned this earlier, like with that online flower shop that got breached unbeknownst to you. It's hard to keep track of these events and know if you're affected since they happen so frequently and maybe the company didn't alert you or whatever reason. But thankfully, there's a service that helps you do that. It's called Have I Been Pwned, and you can find it at haveibeenpwned.com. And yes, by the way, PWNED is pronounced pwned. So you would just go to the website, enter in one of your email addresses, and you'll get back a list of data breaches that contained that email address, as well as what type of data was contained in the breach. So for example, if passwords were compromised, if birth dates were compromised, if social security numbers were compromised. You can also sign up to get notifications whenever a new data breach is added to that website that contains your email address. And if you have correct permissions at your company, you can also sign up to get notifications anytime that any email address at your company is involved in a data breach. I've set this up at SEM, so anytime an SEM email address shows up in a data breach, I get a notification. Have I Been Pwned can also check if a certain password has been involved in any data breaches that it knows about. In other words, you can go there right now and see if there are any data breaches that contain your current passwords. You know, the one that you're reusing all over the place. And this will help you figure out how badly you need to change your passwords right now, because if it's out there floating around, it's just a matter of time before you're a victim of credential stuffing. And I don't have enough time to go into why, on a technical level, it's actually safe that you put in an email address or password on this particular website. So you might have to just take my word for it, or you can email me, contact me at technology@semwealth.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. And so that brings us to the end of this webinar. We've gone over a ton of information today, and I know I'm going kind of fast. I was trying to keep it to about half an hour. I went over that a little bit. So thanks for sticking with me through it all. I know that I wasn't able to hit the nuances of every single thing, so if you have any questions, definitely reach out and let me know. I'll try to summarize everything we went through really quick. Phishing is a big deal, and you're not immune from the attacks or the consequences of those attacks just because you're an individual or a small business. You also need to think critically when evaluating an email. You can use the what's the context questions. You can look at the shenanigans that are going on in a display name and the email address. And you can also just use a bookmark or password manager to completely bypass the link where possible. You should also close your other technical gaps, and some of the most important ways we talked about doing that are do not reuse your passwords. You will become a victim of credential stuffing one day, I promise. Do use a password manager. They are cheap, they're easy, and they make it easy to use completely unique passwords, and they will autofill things for you. And you also should enable 2FA everywhere that you can. It's a common sense second layer of protection, and it is quickly becoming standard practice. So I think I saw a question come in as well. Let me tackle that really quick. How concerned do we need to be about malicious attachments, such as PDFs or Word files? Is there a way to protect us or sniff these out? Yeah, so that's a good question. I emphasized the whole idea of a malicious link in this webinar, but malicious attachments are a big deal as well. And most of the advice that I gave here, except obviously inspecting the link, would apply to malicious attachments as well. So asking context, like if Janet from HR sends you a booby-trapped PDF, is it normal for her to be able to do that? Does the display name match with the email address? Were you expecting to get this email? Things like that should go a long way towards figuring out if it's booby-trapped. And you can have PDFs are a good candidate for malicious attachments, Word files, Office files in general. It used to be really bad with like rogue macros and stuff like that, but it's not so much. I don't want to misspeak. It is a big deal still, but it's not as big a deal as it used to be. And a way to other than trying to examine an email critically, if you've got a good antivirus program, that's going to go a long way as well, because they will. Well, okay, so if you've got a good endpoint antivirus program, Malwarebytes or whatever you guys are using, that will, in a lot of cases, it will catch the PDF or the Word file before it does something malicious. Not all the time. It wouldn't rely on it singularly, but it's designed to be there as a layer of protection in case a malicious attachment gets past your analysis, for example. Another thing that you can do is have a good email filtering solution, because those will go a long way as well. I would say that most of the emails that we get at SEM that have malicious attachments to them are caught by the Office 365 filter. I haven't seen one come through in a long time. Most of what gets through these days are malicious links. So besides just good analysis of an email and trying to determine the context and the display name and all of that, the two technical things that I would suggest there are a good antivirus product and a good email filter. I don't see any other questions come through. So thank you guys for sticking around through this webinar. I know there was a lot of information, and again, I wasn't able to cover all the nuances of these issues. So if you have any specific questions, feel free to contact me at technology@semwealth.com or check out the technology blog. So that's it for today. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.